A lot of cool new cards revealed recently. The voting for the card reveals finally concluded, and boy, were there some sick end cards revealed there. Those two cards in particular are really exciting. They're going to go in increasing mana cost though, so we're going to see the powerhouses at the end. So let's begin with the humble 2-mana Landspear. This card definitely has some advantages over a vanilla 3/2 because when you're buffing a minion for +2 attack, that means that buff is going into like a charge form. Turn 1 Creeper, for example, into Abusive Sergeant has usually been a very strong play. The big difference between this and Abusive Sergeant is that the buff is permanent. If you were to just compare it to like the 1-mana Abusive Sergeant, be like, yeah, it's about the same, but the buff's permanent. It turns out that the buff being permanent isn't that big a deal, since usually giving a minion attack and then having it trade immediately is good, but it is good in the case that the opponent has nothing to trade into. All in all, pretty fair card, but I don't really see this one being OP, say. For example, something to compare it to would be Blessing of Might, which is a Paladin 1-mana card. Give a friendly minion +3 attack permanently. So for 1 more mana, you get 1 less attack, which is kind of rolled into the card and 2 health. And the 1/2 isn't really anything. Turns out that Blessing of Might is actually being played right now, but only in the rushiest of decks. And in rush decks, you usually don't want to necessarily count on a 1-attack minion, first of all. You don't want a 1-attack minion in your rush deck. And you also don't want to count on having to buff something. But that's not terrible because all rush decks play Abusive Sergeant, but that's because it's actually efficiently costed as a 1-mana 2/1. In Arena, it's completely fine, possibly even good, because it has some advantages over a 2-mana 3/2. It has some disadvantages over a 2-mana 3/2 in that you're going to have to play it with a card. All in all, a fair card, just not quite unfair enough to make it into constructed decks, I think. Yes, this does work with Hobgoblin, worth mentioning that. I actually had a Zoo Hobgoblin deck where you ran Creeper, you ran the Echoing Ooze, and Landspear actually could fit in that deck, and I would put it into that deck, so maybe there is some hope in this card after all. Cutpurse, very cool effect. I like how this is something where you can continuously get value. The rogue class happens to be the class which would be best with this card, so it's fitting that it's a rogue class card. The bad news is this card is really directly comparable to Pint-Sized Summoner, which is also a 2-mana 2/2, and also takes a turn to get active before being able to be played, and then always giving you a 1-mana discount. Pint-Sized Summoner can only be used on minions, but it was never really considered for constructed play. In the same way, I don't see Cutpurse seeing play. You could always coin out the Cutpurse, yes, and then you get the coin, and then you coin out the SI7 agent, and that's the dream. But it turns out that you can always just coin out the Pint-Sized Summoner, and then you could do your 3-drops anyways, but no classes tried to do that. I think this card could have been a 2/3, and then it would be quite good. In Arena, this is also going to be a bit too weak, because it is in the rare slot, and the Pint-Sized Summoner is also in the rare slot. It just turns out you can't play the card and then reliably have it survive for the next turn. And yes, to some extent, it is a little bit better than Pint-Sized Summoner, because getting the coin enables combos, and it enables you to discount spells, and you can save up your coins and you don't have to actually use it. So it is better than Pint-Sized Summoner, but that's not saying much, because Pint-Sized Summoner never really saw any consideration for play, in the same way that I don't see this seeing play. The big thing to realize is that, yes, you can dream of having so many coin values, but a 2/2 isn't going to stick on the board, even if you coin it out on turn 1. I mean, actually, if you coin it out on turn 1, it could work, but you'd have to have exactly this card in your opening hand, and you have to go second, and it's like, the coin is already so good for Rogue, you coin out the SI7 agent on 2. No. Light's Champion, because those demons are absolutely getting out of control. We call upon the Champion of Light to handle them. Most comparable to Spellbreaker, which is a 4-mana 4/3. Light's Champion gets a discount, but can only target demons. There are a lot of good demons to silence, to be fair. You've got Voidcaller, you've got the Imp Gang boss. Those are common silence targets. But a little too specific. Also worth mentioning that Spellbreaker costs too much anyways, and Owl is replacing it because you really mainly run it for the silence effect, but also getting a small card on top of it is better. This card kind of splits the difference, but really the difference is that most of the time it's a 3 mana 4/3, which is obviously not going to fit into any constructed deck. A lot of people have joked that this is the hard counter to those demon fused decks. Fear not, those of you who are afraid of the demon fused decks completely running over the meta. Blizzard preemptively saw that, and they've gotten the Lights champion just in case that happens. Watch out, guys. Not only the demon fuse, but we've gotten one step ahead of those Dreadsteed shenanigans. In Arena, this card's a 3 mana 4/3, which is like average. 3 mana 4/3, that's like, yeah, okay. Alright, this is actually a really exciting card, and I feel like this is one of the first times where the effect is joustified with the joust mechanic of Healing Wave. So you've got this compared to Healing Touch. Now you have Restore 7 health, which is a little less good, and Healing Touch wasn't being run, but the upside is pretty big. The upside, you get 14. That's awesome. So here's what I had hoped Joust cards would do. To have the bonus from the Joust be enough that you would actually want to build your deck around Joust to some extent, to like be able to affect the odds, and then even if you miss the Joust, okay, fine, it's a slightly less good effect, but still fine. This is exactly that card. This could be exactly the tool needed for Ancestor's Call decks to arrive. Ancestor's Call decks usually ran a few big cards like Malagos and Emperor Thaurissan, like maybe some Azure Drakes. And if you have exactly that deck, you win jousts a lot of the time. Like even past Control Warrior, past Handlock, those decks had to run a few low-cost minions. You could conceivably come up with a Shaman combo deck which didn't run any of the low-cost minions. So that's pretty exciting. And one of the weaknesses of that deck is that it could sometimes just get run over, and we got a tool for it. And one of the first Shaman class cards which can heal you. I'm excited for this card. This card has the potential to shift the meta by introducing a new deck. Some kind of deck that just really goes into the late game, or some combo in the Shaman case. And I'm glad that Shaman got this card. It's a good Joust card, so I'm really happy with this one. In Arena, this card probably isn't going to be good for the same reason that Healing Touch isn't good. Just restoring health isn't good enough when your game plan is all about board control. Astral Communion. I really like the design on this card. I hope Blizzard continues to push these crazy cards, which have kind of niche purposes but have big effects. That's what makes the game interesting, I think. This was the card that Kripparrian got to preview, and if you want to learn all about Astral Communion's ins and outs, it's a good place to go to. Kind of see like an 8-minute video on Astral Communion. I've had a lot of time to think about this, and yes, there's some dreams where you go Innervate, coin Astral Communion, and then you just keep top decking the big cards like Ancient of Lore, and then just keep playing them. There's also the theory that you can like develop the board first with the Loot Hoarder and an Acolyte of Pain, and then you play the Astral Communion, then you trade those away, and then you draw the cards and you play them immediately, since you can actually just use the 10 mana crystals immediately. By the way, it's been clarified that if you're at 10 mana and you play Astral Communion, you get a excess mana card. Of course, you would have to discard the rest of your hand, but if you top deck it and you have exactly 0 cards in your hand, hey, that's a bonus. Ultimately, I don't really see this card seeing any play because discard your hand is kind of extreme. The exact moment where you want to play this is on turn 1, 2, 3, and 4. And you play it earlier with Innervate or Coin. You play it on 4 if you're going first, ideally, and then you just continue to do top deck big cards. But in order for that to work, you have to both draw Astral Communion in your opening hand and continue to draw late game cards. Or the dream is you start with Innervate and Astral Communion, but then you also have to just keep top decking big cards. Very tough to do. With very little utility in between, this card is really extreme. Could fit into a ramp druid deck, it certainly could. The fact that it can actually draw a card if you are at 10 mana is a nice bonus. I'll give it that. It's not a useless top deck if you have 0 cards in your hand. That fact kind of pushed me a little bit more towards this being viable. Anyways, interesting card. In Arena, this card is really bad. Don't pick this in Arena. Dreadsteed! This is another really cool effect. I've always dreamed of this minion which never dies and keeps coming back. It's a shame that it costs 4 mana and is only a 1/1. But this is a card that I'm sure saw a lot of testing, and it was like, oh, we can't make this a 3 mana 1/1. It would be too scary. We can't make this a 4 mana 2/1. It would be way too scary. And yeah, I could see that happening. It's entirely possible. This is a really cool effect. Very unique, and I'm not surprised that it costs this much. I don't entirely think it would be imbalanced at 3, but I'm sure that the testing was done and it was too spooky for them. At 4 mana, it seems like it's going to be outpriced. If this were a 3 mana 1/1, I would go into this and be like, I guess they did a lot of testing and they couldn't make a 2 mana 1/1 because that would be OP. So they made it 3 mana. That's a little daring, but we'll see how that goes. I can't think of anything that would make it 2 Imba at 3 mana, but... Well, anyways, we're in 4 mana world, as it turns out. So, some fun facts about it is if you play the Dreadsteed, and the Patron Warrior has 8 mana, they can fill up their board of patrons. That's pretty fun. If you're up against the Patron Warrior, and you somehow get Warsong Commander and Dreadsteed, you can actually clear all their patrons. That's also a pretty fun fact, too. It's a really good card to put Power Overwhelming on. It's a good card to ensure that you have a minion on the board. You basically get to deal 1 damage each turn with it, so you can slowly whittle away your opponent. So even if you have no combos, it kind of stays on the board and helps out. One of the things that was compared to Dreadsteed is something like Implosion. So Implosion, you average deal 3 damage and you get 3 1/1s. So if you're using Dreadsteed to do 6 damage over 6 turns, then you kind of break even with Implosion, which deals 6 damage over 2 turns, arguably, sometimes. You can combo this with Anima Golem, yes, but the cost is pretty high. If you're spending 4 mana on turn 4 for a 1/1, you might fall too far behind. Hobgoblin doesn't work with this, except on the first Dreadsteed, since the future summons don't get the buffs on Hobgoblin. The first one does, but no. Anyways, an interesting card. Very cool effect. This is what I said about Grim Patron as well. So, watch out. But no, I don't see Dreadsteed being the next Grim Patron deck. No. One of the big things, actually, that I forgot to mention is that Baron Rivendare is actually a combo with Dreadsteed. You go turn 4 Dreadsteed, turn 5 Baron Rivendare, and then you have 2 Dreadsteeds. And then, say you also Mortal Coil your Dreadsteed, and then you have 4 Dreadsteeds. And then from then on out, you're just going to be able to deal 4 damage to anything you want every single turn. When I think of it that way, it suddenly doesn't seem that bad. If you manage to find some way to give Dreadsteed charge, then, well, all of your Dreadsteeds charge, then you would, be set. But Warlock doesn't have that tool. So, cool card. I'm glad they printed a card like this. I don't think it's going to be viable, though. In Arena, this card is still probably too slow, though it could conceivably be used to help board control. Wrangler. So the first thing to establish is, in a Hunter, you're kind of looking for some pretty big stats for 5 mana. Not even... Or sometimes Fel Reaver is run in Hunter, and you get a 5 mana 8/8. This one seems not directed towards the face deck, so it is possible that they wouldn't run Fel Reaver, though Fel Reaver was a possible run in the mid-range Hunter decks also. Most common cards to fit in this Wrangler deck would probably be Web Spinner, it would be Houndmaster, it would be Haunted Creeper. Kind of fits right into the mid-range Hunter deck right now. So the question is this effect worth it? This is a big effect. You're summoning a random beast. Anything from Well, basically anything Web Spinner can get. So anything from Lorne to King Crush, all the way down to Hungry Crab and Captain's Parrot, all of your favorite different results from Web Spinner. Now it just summons it onto the field. Very similar card to Bane of Doom, where the results are wide and varied, but on average, you're gonna get a pretty good beast. Believe the calculation has been done, and you're roughly getting a 3 to 4 mana on average cost beast. And if your average 3 to 4 mana beast is something like a 3/3 or a 4/4, then you're already getting value. It's like a 5 mana 7/7, 5 mana 6/7, 5 mana 6/6. And the fact that you're getting another beast is synergy for more of your Houndmasters. This card, you can just save the Web Spinner in your hand, play the Web Spinner, play the Wrangler. The basic comparison is really just, if Bane of Doom is a good card, then this is a good card, right? And for the most part, that's kind of true. I'm going to really quickly rattle off all of the cards that are good value off of Wrangler, and I'm going to define good value as something higher than a 3/3 really, because if you have a 5 mana and 3/3 summon a 3/3, you're doing pretty well. Here are the cards. Armored Warhorse, Oasis Snapjaw, Core Hound, Ironford Grizzly, you're getting 3/3 Taunt, Tall Strider, Starving Buzzard, kind of, Tiger, Rhino, Core Rager, Emperor Cobra, King of Beasts, Savannah Highmane, Kodo, Gozrilla, King Crush, King Mukla, Myexna, Malorn, the Beast. Oh yes, Jungle Panther. Mukla's Champion would be a pretty good one to get. Savage Combatant, the new one. There's quite a few where you're almost getting the value. Bloodfin Raptor, River Crocolisk, Direwolf Alpha, Haunted Creeper, Scavenging Hyena, Ironbeak Owl, Silverback Patriarch. I'm actually going to count Web Spinner as a reasonable effect also. There's some where you're losing the value. The Stone Tusk Boar, the Timberwolf, Captain's Parrot, the Young Dragon Hawk, the Angry Chicken, and the Hungry Crab. Big range of cards, but I think overall you're winning. Anyways, point is, cards competitively priced, and therefore it should see some play and experimentation in mid-range Hunter, or even Beast Focus Hunter. Whatever you want to describe the specific Hunter deck that this goes into as. But it is competitive. In Arena, it's going to be pretty much similar to Houndmaster. If you have Beast, it's good. If you don't have Beast, it's bad. Sea Reaver, welcome to Flame Leviathan 2.0. For the Warrior, it got buffed from Flame Leviathan because it's -1 mana, and it's -1 attack, which means it can't get BGH'd. Unfortunately, you don't deal 2 damage to all minions, you only deal it to your minions, as it emphasizes. The most obvious deck to put this in would be Grim Patron Warrior, where you battle rage and then you activate your Grim Patrons, but that's so situational, and sometimes you don't actually want to whirlwind your stuff because then you would lose the game. If you want the free whirlwind effect, you usually want to instead equip a Death Spite and just have it sit there. So it's an interesting effect. It is on the Boulder Fist Ogre stats, so usually this is better than Boulder Fist Ogre in the case that you're putting this into your warrior deck, because you've presumably organized your deck so that your minions want to get damaged. But so far, a deck that wants its minions to be damaged hasn't really surfaced other than Grim Patron Warrior, of course, but I think the Grim Patron Warrior deck doesn't really want this fairly inconsistent card, and sometimes it like just draws it in the opening hand and then it's a rock as 6 mana 6/7. The Grim Patron Warrior has sometimes put in like duds in their deck, like Harrison Jones, which is a 5 mana 5/4, sometimes do nothing. So would they be willing to put in Sea Reaver, which is sometimes a 6 mana 6/7, do nothing? And that's an interesting question, but I argue no. The card is not as bad as people think it is, because unlike the Flame Leviathan, which is a 7 mana 7/7, which is bad because of BGH and because it costs 1 more mana for 1 more attack, 6 mana 6/7 is Boulder Fist Ogre, which is competitive. To some extent. Boulder Fist Ogre isn't actually played in any deck, which means you need a slightly better effect than Boulder Fist Ogre, but this does have a slightly better effect than Boulder Fist Ogre. So, meh. In Arena, this card will usually be less good than Boulder Fist Ogre, because you probably won't want your minions to get damaged. So it'll actually almost be a strictly worse Boulder Fist Ogre in Arena. Boulder Fist Ogre is a pretty good card though, and this is an epic card, so you compare it with the other cards in epic. Probably it turns out to be like somewhere between average card to a good card in Arena, just because Boulder Fist Ogre is so good in Arena. And here we go into the exciting cards. Rhonin, the Mage legendary card. 8 mana 7/7. Add 3 copies of Arcane Missiles to your hand on death. Wow. Probably the most apt comparison to make these cards which draw cards on these heavy cards would be Ancient of Lore. And so often, I would think, oh man, if only this class had Ancient of Lore, it would be so good. Ancient of Lore, 7 mana 5/5, draw 2 cards. Rhonin, 1 more mana, you get +2/+2, and you get an additional card. Now, the bad news is these cards are Arcane Missiles, but the good news is Arcane Missiles is not a terrible card. In some ways, you're basically getting a Avenging Wrath, which costs 3 mana and deals 1 more damage, and that's pretty good. Furthermore, this is Mage we're talking about. You know what a good card to combo cheap Arcane Missiles is? It's kind of the basis for some of the tempo mages out there. That's right, Archmage Antonidas and Rhonin, best friends for life. So, if you thought Death Rattle add 3 copies of Arcane Missiles was good, how about Death Rattle add 3 copies of Arcane Missiles and 3 Fireballs? And Rhonin is a pretty good friend of Malygos. You play the Rhonin, and then you let it die, and then you play the Emperor Thaurissan, and then you play the Malygos, and then you deal 24 damage if the opponent has no board, or just 24 damage to stuff. And that's pretty fun too. So yes, Rhonin. Oh man, I love cards that draw you cards, and this is a good one. In Arena, this card's going to be really good. In a world where War Golem is okay, adding 1 mana to get 3 copies of Arcane Missiles is pretty good. The bad news is it's a Death Rattle, it's not you immediately draw it, so it can get silenced off, and silencing off 3 copies of Arcane Missiles is a pretty big deal. That said though, I still think it's good enough. Icehowl, the most fearsome Yeti of them all. This is a Yeti, right? Kind of looks like a Yeti. Well, there's 2 things to compare this card with. The first card is Ragnaros. Ragnaros kind of charges. 8 mana 8/8, deal 8 damage randomly. With Icehowl, you can actually target who you hit. So that costs 1 extra mana, and you get an extra 2 attack and 2 health. Now the bad news is it compares unfavorably to Ragnaros because when you hit something you actually take damage. And you cannot hit the face. Obviously if this card could hit the face, it would quite possibly be OP. Yeah, that would probably be OP. So I really like the restriction on this one. Makes it interesting. Sometimes your opponent has an 8/8 on the board, and you're forced to play Ragnaros, and you're just gonna pray, oh, please let me hit that 8/8. If I don't hit it, I'll lose the game. You pay 1 more mana, and you can do it. And then you get a 10/2, which is not great, but the battle cry is almost like kill a minion. So if you compare this with Siphon Soul, then Icehowl costs 3 more mana and gives you like this beast, which, well, it's not a beast actually. And there was actually some interesting side conversation between Kriparian and Ben Brode about, oh, why isn't this a beast? And then Ben Brode's like, oh, Yetis have always been humanoids. And then there's like pictures of old Icehowls which have the beast tag on them, and now it's not actually a beast and it might be a humanoid. But that's random lore. This card has kind of gotten laughed off by some people, but I actually think it's completely reasonably costed. I think at 8 mana it might cost too little. You do want to just charge into basically anything here. It almost always gets you a 2-for-1, which you would hope that a card costing 9 mana would, but it can get you a 2-for-1 against some really strong cards. You can't combo this with Silence the turn that you play it, because then you silence off the charge. But what you can do is you can Icehowl into some big minion, and then the next turn you can silence Icehowl, and you can actually attack the face with it. The second card to compare this with would be North Sea Kraken, which also is in this set and fills up the 9 mana slot. 9/7, deal 4 damage. And I'd say compared to North Sea Kraken, Icehowl is a lot better because instead of a 9/7, you're getting a 10/10, and if you're dealing 4 damage to something, usually that minion would be something like a 3/4, 4/4, 5/4. So Icehowl, you basically get a 10-5 or a 10-6 or a 10/7 in addition to killing that. But not only is it better than Battlecry deal 4 damage, it's Battlecry deal 10 damage, so a lot more flexibility in what you can kill. And this is one of the cards that you would really want to get with Aviana. Turn 10 Aviana Icehowl, and then Icehowl serves as Aviana's Bruiser. It's kind of interesting. Ultimately, it probably costs too much, but before people just completely discount this card, I think it has some very real possibilities because it does compare to Ragnaros to some extent. It has its pros and cons. In Arena, this card will actually be pretty good because you can probably nearly guarantee a 2-for-1 with Icehowl, and 3-for-1, 4-for-1, it could happen. A funny combination is Icehowl plus Mogre the Ogre, and then Mogre can get Icehowl to attack the face. And finally, the Big Daddy, another legendary that costs 10, putting Varian Wrynn alongside legends such as Deathwing and nobody else. So we were talking about Ancient of Lore, 7 mana 5/5, draw 2 cards. Man, if that card were in Control Warrior, boy would you want to play it. Okay, now we have Varian Wrynn. Ooh. So you don't only draw 2 cards, you draw 3 cards. For 3 more mana, you get an extra card and 2/2 of stats. But if that wasn't enough, you also get to put any minions you drew just right onto there. Just cheat them in. And Control Warrior does play some big cards. You don't get the battle cry of those effects, but the dream is possible, where you play Varian Wrynn, and then you get like the Bruisers, Ragnaros to go with it. Maybe you feel particularly fun. You get the Icehowl out there also, because why not? Grommash out there. It's worth mentioning that some of these are actually not great to put directly into the battlefield, because some you might want the battle cry. For example, Alexstrasza, Grommash to some extent. But oh man, Varian Wrynn! I love playing Control Warrior, and there's no question that Varian Wrynn deserves a spot in your Control Warrior deck. Some people might wonder, how does this interact with Chromaggus? It turns out that you do also copy the cards, but you can't put them into the battlefield. When I looked at the wording of Chromaggus, it was basically whenever you draw a card, gain a copy. So gaining a copy isn't drawing a card. So that's how I see it. Of course, you would put the copy that you drew with the Varian. You're not even that afraid that Varian Wrynn has 7 attack for BGH purposes, because the Control Warrior deck runs so many cards which can get BGH'd that getting your 7/7 BGH isn't that big a deal. Strangely enough, Varian Wrynn is probably not as good in Arena as it is in Constructed, because if you're playing Control Warrior, which is where you want to play Varian Wrynn, you actually have a game plan to get to turn 10. A little bit harder to get to turn 10 in Arena, to be honest, but probably still a really good card. You can think of it almost as you would need an entire turn where you don't have to deal with threats from the opponent to actually play Varian Wrynn and still survive. A little bit more difficult in Arena. I think it'll be a good card in Arena, but perhaps not fantastic. So, yeah, Varian Wrynn. Embrace that variance.